So now that we've talked about the common portions of our QuoteServices app case study, let's start digging deeper into the various microservice implementations. And we'll start first with the Handey microservice structure and functionality. And this particular part of the lesson has two parts to it. And the first part will kind of give you an overview of the structure and functionality of the HandeyController and the HandeyService microservice classes, which use the R2DBC and Project Reactor reactive types. And then we'll talk about the repository part next. So let's start by talking about the application itself. As you can see, the Handey application provides the entry point into the Spring Web Flux-based version of the Handey Quote microservice. This is something we've seen before. It extends the base application, which is that reusable common class we looked at before that makes this whole thing aware of Eureka. And then we go ahead and have some annotations here. And these annotations inform Spring that number one, this is defining a microservice. It's a Spring Boot application. Secondly, that it's got some entities that need to be dealt with, and it tells you what class to go define the entities in. And then the final thing it does is it says, we're going to be using the R2DBC reactive relational repository, database repository. And so it tells you that that's happening. It also says where to find the class that implements that particular reactive relational data structure database capability. So those are the things that we have on the application side. Pretty straightforward, but you probably haven't seen enable R2DBC repositories before. And then the last thing we do is we go ahead and we call the run method that we inherited from base application, passing in the Handey application class to start the whole ball rolling and to register this microservice with the Eureka server-side discovery service. So now let's go ahead and talk a bit about the HandeyController. So as you all know by this point, after many discussions, the controllers are used to map HTTP requests to endpoint handler methods. In this case, we're mapping both GET and POST requests. And the HandeyController is a REST controller, which means that the methods it defines will automatically serialize return objects into HTTP response objects, just something we want to do to clean up the code a bit. As usual, we have a few auto-wired fields. The first one is called application context, and we use the application context in order to be able to get information back to Eureka about whether our application controller is still alive or not. And then we also have a service that's auto-wired. Again, this is pretty much par for the course. We've seen this many, many times. So we auto-wire the HandeyController to use the Handey service. Here's the info method that is used by Eureka to find out whether this application is still alive, whether the controller is still alive. And it does that by sending a GET request, just a slash. As you can see, it's just the slash endpoint path. And if that occurs, then this method gets called and it goes ahead and returns back to the Eureka discovery service an OK response saying this application is up and running at this particular thread, which of course will be a virtual thread because we're using virtual threads. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the endpoint handler methods. This is not all of them. This is most of them. They didn't all fit on the slide. But we've got get all quotes, post quotes, and search. And these methods handle get and post requests by simply forwarding them to the underlying service. You can see here that each of these methods also return Flux objects based on the responses they get back from the service. And so we use the fluxes here in order to be able to have asynchronous operations from the client point of view. So this is something that's different from what we've talked about before. Up to this point, we've typically passed back lists of things, but now we're passing back fluxes. And you can also see that we have basically get and post mapping annotations added here, which essentially instruct Spring to route the incoming requests to these endpoint handler methods so that they can be turned into Java method calls. And you can see we've also got the request body annotation, which says to treat these things as lists of integers. Otherwise, they wouldn't get extracted from the body of the HTTP request properly. So now let's turn our attention to the Handey service. And this, of course, as usual, defines implementation methods that are forwarded to from the HandeyController. We, as always, annotate a service with the service annotation that indicates that this class is the, quote, business logic for the controller. And the service annotation also enables auto detection and wiring of dependent classes via class path scanning and so forth. Once again, as usual, we auto-wire everything together. So the service is auto-wiring to the reactive quote repository. So we don't have to worry about defining the initialization. That's handled for us by Spring's dependency injection model. And then we've got some implementation methods. We've got postquote, search, searchEX, and so on. And you can see, once again, all these methods return the flux reactive type. And all they do is they simply forward to the corresponding methods that do this type of lookup in the underlying repository, the reactive quotes repository. Now, as you can see here, when you look up the quotes, it looks up the quotes by doing find all by ID, passing in the quote IDs. If we do one of the search methods that's going to search for anything, we call find all by quote containing any in. Otherwise, we call find all by quote containing all in, and so on and so forth. So everything's just forwarding to the repository. Because of this, because all we're doing is forwarding, we could remove this service and simply have the controller forward to the repository directly. That's a perfectly valid way to implement this code. I kind of left it this way because we've gotten into this kind of pattern of having the controller talk to the service, which then talks to the repository, because sometimes the service does other things. But in this case, it's really just a bunch of pass-throughs. So it probably would make sense to actually skip that extra step and save ourselves a few nanoseconds of indirection and forwarding overhead. So that's the end of the overview of the Handey Microservices Structure and Functionality Part 1, where we looked at the controller, the service, and the application. Part 2, which we'll look at next, is going to take a look at the repository.